How many people like to travel? Anybody? Yeah, I know a lot of people like to travel. Yeah. Have you ever been to Africa? Anybody been to Africa? I don't see any hands yet. I haven't been there, but I think I might want to go there someday. Well, a few years ago, I learned something about the border between Kenya and Uganda. Recent conflict may have changed this some, I'm not sure, but a few years ago when people traveling between Kenya and Uganda wanted to go from one country to the other, they had to go through a checkpoint. Well, that sounds pretty normal, doesn't it? Guards check them out, look through their baggage, make sure all their paperwork's in order before giving them permission to pass through the barricade and leave the country. But then they encounter something that's not so normal. After passing through the barricade and leaving one country, they're not yet in the other country. They have to walk or drive 100 yards before passing through another barricade and entering the other country. Unlike the border crossings between many other nations, the Kenyan-Ugandan border, for 100 yards, you're not in either country. For 100 yards, you're in what they call the borderland. You're between the place you left and the place that you want to go. Everyone traveling between Kenya and Uganda has to spend some time in this borderland. What really surprised me about the borderland is that some people go in and they never come back out. They walk out of one country, but never walk into the other. They stop. They stay. They set up home. Some start businesses. They live and die in the borderland. Many of us live in a borderland too. If you've given your life to Jesus, you do. You've passed through one barricade, but you haven't yet passed through the next. You live between where you were before you put your faith in Jesus and where you will ultimately end up. You live between the life of sin that you left and the life of perfection that you'll enjoy with Jesus in his heavenly kingdom. And this in-between place, this borderland, is where you need to be. Because God does some of his very best work in the borderland. We get a great example of this from the Israelites. You may remember after hightailing it out of slavery in Egypt and crossing the Red Sea, they didn't walk straight into the land of milk and honey, did they? They spent many years between the two. And it was in that borderland between Egypt and the promised land that God began teaching the Israelites to follow him, to stop trusting other gods and idols and earthly powers like Pharaoh for their survival. God demonstrated they could trust him, the one true God, the Lord, the creator of heaven and earth. God proved that they could trust him as he gave them food and drink and everything else they needed for life. And it was in that borderland, as they walked with God for 40 years, that God began transforming the Israelites from what they were, a loosely connected, disorganized collection of families, into a real nation. It's where God gave them the 10 Commandments so they could learn how to live together in peace and harmony. They weren't slaves anymore. They were free to live any way they wanted to live. So God offered them direction, walked alongside them like a parent does with a child learning to ride the bike so they don't hurt themselves or anybody else. And to help them learn to enjoy his blessings like no other people ever had. With the Israelites, God did some of his best work, some amazing work in the borderland. And as we live out our lives in this borderland, God can do that same kind of amazing work with us. He can transform us as we walk with Jesus, as we adopt his ways and learn and grow in our faith. And over time, as we become his disciples, we're filled with an amazing sense of peace and find ourselves enjoying more and more of his blessings than we ever had before. That's when he passes the baton on to us so that he can work through us to draw more people into his way of life, to draw more people in and make them into his disciples. I hope you know there are people all around us who are searching for this way of life that Jesus offers. They may not know it. They may not know what to call it. But many people are trying to make sense of their experiences in this broken world. And they wonder, is there a God? Does he care? Would he help someone like me? Who am I? How do I fit in? Some wonder, if there is a God, why does he allow pain? Why has this terrible thing happened to me or my friend or someone in my family? There are lots of people out there with questions, problems, hurts, burdens, who need Jesus. And Jesus wants us to help them find their way back home to him. This leads right into our Bible reading this morning. I'll be reading from the Gospel of Matthew, which is the first book in the New Testament. I'll be reading from Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 and 29. Please stand as you're able for our Bible reading this morning. Come to me, Jesus said. Come to me, all you who are struggling hard and carrying heavy loads, and I will give you rest. Put on my yoke and learn from me. I'm gentle and humble, and you will find rest for yourselves. This is the word of the Lord. Please be seated. Jesus has the answer for everything. And we can help people find him when we walk with him and become more like him. When we're humble and gentle. When we're inviting and welcoming. When we're willing to invite and welcome anyone and everyone into this borderland. So how are you doing with that? How are you doing with that? Some church people are arrogant and judgmental. They're condescending toward non-Christians. They're condescending toward other Christians. They're condescending toward anyone who they perceive as less spiritual than themselves. They act so good and holy and virtuous, as if they're part of some elite group. They make me sick. They turn my stomach. Worse than that, what matters far more than that, is that kind of behavior really angers God, because it turns people away from Jesus. Jesus never acted anything like that. He was God in the flesh. But he didn't act like he was too good for anybody, did he? No. He said, come to me, all of you who are struggling hard and carrying heavy loads. Come to me if you're sick, if you're a sinner, if you're lost, if you're beaten down, come to me, and I will give you rest. Put on my yoke and learn from me. It really helps if we're willing to learn. Put on my yoke and learn from me. I'm gentle and humble, and you will find rest for yourselves. Some time back, I met an old pastor who shared with me his biggest regret from ministry. It happened while he was serving a church in a small Texas town. Shortly after moving to town, he developed a friendship with a businessman in that town, a professional. And the man didn't go to church, but this pastor stopped by the man's office every week. Once a week, he'd go and sit down and talk with him and have a cup of coffee. Over the next few years, the church that pastor served did real well. They started new ministries, new people began to come. It was really flourishing. Then after 4 years, the pastor received a call from the bishop, told him it was time for him to move. The next time he stopped by his friend's office for a cup of coffee, he told his friend that he was getting ready to move. Toward the end of the conversation, that pastor invited his friend to church. For the very first time, the expression on his friend's face changed abruptly. He asked, "How could you? I've been meeting with you for years. You've always told me about everything going on in your church, but you never invited me. So now that you're leaving, you ask me to come to your church? You have got to be kidding." And the man never did go. There's a lesson you and I can learn from that. We can do better than that. And if we want to do what Jesus wants us to do, we will. Apparently, that pastor's friend was open to the idea of going to church. Apparently, he was just waiting for an invitation. Now, there's no doubt he could have got up off his backside and gone to church any time on his own. The fact of the matter is he didn't. And sometimes all it takes is an invitation. Some people you know are just waiting to be invited to church. I promise you that's true. According to a study I read, 82% of unchurched people said they would go to church if somebody invited them. But you know what? Only 2% of Christians ever invite someone to church. 82% of unchurched people say they would go to church if somebody invited them, but only 2% of us ever invite someone. I don't think I need to tell you that's a major problem. That is a huge problem. A personal invitation is by far the single most effective way to get someone new to come to church. But we don't do it, and we wonder why more people don't come. It's not big billboards. It's not flyers, although advertising definitely does help. Advertising is usually money well spent if it's planned out well. But a personal invitation is the most effective way to get someone new to come to church, and it's completely free. When you invite people, so I'm making an assumption here, when you invite people, you may need to remind them a few times before they remember to come. When you invite people, you may need to go pick them up the first couple of times they come just to make sure they get here. They may be willing, but something might happen in their lives that they think, well, I just can't go today. Something always comes up. Something will always come up to keep them home. So you got to be there to help them work through all of that. The thing is, there are lots of people out there who want what we have and are waiting for you to invite them. And when you do, the rest of us need to make sure they feel welcome when they get here. A few years ago, Karen and I had a very memorable experience. A friend of ours was driving in heavy rain. She hydroplaned and rolled her vehicle with 2 children in the back seat. They were hanging upside down when the vehicle came to a rest. By the grace of God, no one was hurt, but they were shaken up pretty good. Our friend called, wanted us to come and get her kids for a couple of hours. She said she had a relative nearby who was on her way to pick her up at that moment, but she wanted us to come to a relative's house to pick up the kids for a while. So we got the address and set out. We'd never been to this person's house before, but we got there as quickly as we could and didn't have any trouble finding the place. As it turns out, lots of people found that house that day. There was something going on inside. A big party. Cars were parked up and down the street. We parked, walked to the front door, rang the doorbell. Then we knocked. Then we knocked again, harder. But no one answered. Kind of surprised us, all these cars out front. No one's answering the door. We thought maybe everybody was in a room in the back of the house, or maybe they were all out in the backyard. We didn't know. So we decided to open the door and peek in. We saw people everywhere. The whole front room was filled with people. So even though it felt awkward, we pushed the door the rest of the way open and we walked in. We had big smiles on our face, kind of cheesy smiles, feeling a little bit embarrassed. We just walked into someone's house we didn't even know. We said, hello. We looked around for a response, but no one spoke. A room full of adults. No one even looked in our direction. So we spoke louder, hello. Still no response. We kept looking at people, hoping to tell somebody why we were there, that we'd come to pick up our friend's children, because we didn't see our friend at that point. But everyone was so caught up in their own conversations and their own little worlds, no one in that room ever acknowledged that we were there. Talk about awkward. So Karen and I decided to walk further into the house, through that room and on into the kitchen. We didn't know what else to do. As we stepped into the kitchen, we almost bumped into somebody as she hurried back and forth. 2 or 3 women were hurrying around, putting out food and drinks for the guests. They all passed by us several times, but never looked at us, never spoke a word. We couldn't believe it. Then I saw a kitchen window. Looked out back, I saw more people out back. We thought maybe our friend is out there, so we started walking toward the door. That's just at the moment when our friend walked into the kitchen and joined us. We hugged her, we spoke with her for a few minutes, got her children, and we got out of that place just as quickly as we could. We didn't know anybody in that house other than our friend, and by that point in time, we really didn't care to get to know anybody in that house. What we did know is we had no desire to ever go back. It's a real shame when people have that kind of experience at a church. When their worship experience feels like they've walked in on somebody else's family reunion. Awkward. It's a shame when Jesus' followers don't act any more welcoming than the people in that house did that day. It's a shame, but it happens. It happens more often than you might believe. And when it does, people just don't want to come back. We celebrated Back to Church Sunday last week. It was a great Sunday. And a great opportunity to invite somebody to church. It gives us a real good excuse, right? Hey, we're having to Back to Church Sunday. We're told, our pastor said, the woman who did the announcement said, invite someone to church, so I'm inviting you. But you really don't need an excuse, do you? You can invite anybody, anytime. You can invite someone next week. You can invite somebody every single week. A few years back, I was giving some presentation to various groups to church groups on being more inviting and welcoming. I spoke about the need to be attentive to the guests, how we need to make sure we don't get so caught up talking to our own friends who are here every week that we ignore the people who are here for the very first time. Toward the end of one of my presentations, a man who was around 70, he raised his hand, so I called on him. I said, "You have a question?" He said, "No. I don't have a question. I just want to say something that's on my mind." I'm out running here and there all week long. I'm going places and I'm doing things. So I look forward to coming to church on Sundays and having a chance to catch up with my friends over a cup of coffee. I'm not interested in turning away from my conversations with them to talk to someone who might be here for the first time. That's just how I feel. I said, "Well, it sounds like you really enjoy your friends." And the man began nodding as I continued. It sounds like you really enjoy talking together, keeping up on what's going on in each other's lives. I think that's an important aspect of the church. He said, you're right. Then I asked him a question. I said, well, don't you think other people are looking for the same thing that you enjoy so much? Don't you think they need that too? It seems to me you could talk to a few of the guests before gathering with your friends around the coffee pot. You might even invite them over to talk with you and your friends because you've got something that they need. You've got something they need. Well, the guy wasn't totally convinced on the spot. Well, that was all right. He did come around. He was a real friendly, real kind man. And over the next few years, we became close friends. In fact, he and his wife became some of the best friends Karen and I had at the time. My friends, I hope you know that we're part of the greatest thing going on earth. We're part of the greatest thing going on earth. We're part of the community that Jesus Christ established himself. And the vast majority of us got into this because we were invited and made to feel welcome. Now it's our turn. It's our turn to invite and welcome people into the church, into this borderland, where God does some of his very best work. Amen.